Okay, so here we're going to go over Chapter 8 of Armin Alchin's Universal Economics that he co-wrote with William Allen. Okay, so let's start with just like a quick review. Okay, so the first law of demand, right, is basically, it says that demand curves slope down. Okay, it's been expressed in a number of ways in this class, so I'm going to give you a couple ways. One is to say that demand curves slope down. Another one is to say that there exists an inverse relationship between price and the quantity demanded. That's the same thing as a downward sloping demand curve. And the way Alchin and Allen like to phrase it is that a sufficiently higher price will decrease the quantity demanded, and a sufficiently lower price will increase the quantity demanded. Okay, but these are all different ways of saying the same basic idea, that demand curves slope down. Okay, so what determines quantity demanded? Okay, price is obviously one important factor. Okay, in determining the quantity demanded, but plenty of other things are going to matter too. So income is another one that's obvious. Less obviously, though, factors like age, gender, education, and overall health will also affect quantity demanded at each price. Given this, why do economists focus so much on price? Okay, so in reality, so why focus on price? And I'll put that in quotation marks. So really, economists aren't all that interested in price. We're more interested in what happens in the world to changes in prices, and how changes in the world will manifest themselves as changes in price. So for example, back in the long ago time of the 1990s, we as a society figured out that eating Cheerios was associated with reducing cholesterol and having better overall health. Okay, so because of this new information, sales of Cheerios increased. So let's just put this in terms of like a supply and demand graph. Okay, so I still, even though we talked about earlier how demand, or supply rather, is just demand curves in reverse, it's still really easy for us to show, the supply curve instead. Okay, so let's just call this the market for Cheerios. Okay, and so because of the new information that Cheerios lowered your cholesterol and were overall better for you for your health than other, in that time, sugary cereals, what we could see really quickly was that the demand for Cheerios was going to increase, or did increase. Okay, so this is a shift to the right of the demand curve. Okay, and when this happened, the sales of Cheerios increased in terms of how quickly boxes of Cheerios would actually be sold at grocery stores. However, production didn't increase right away. So what ended up happening? Well, what ends up happening is that the price actually started to creep up. Okay, so the price ends up rising. We get to something along here, okay, where we had higher prices for Cheerios. Now I've drawn it deliberately exaggerated so as to actually make it noticeable on this picture. Okay, but what we also saw were other companies starting to imitate Cheerios at least a little bit, so including more fiber and whole grains into their cereal. Well, what this did is it increased the supply curve and made it so that Cheerios actually had to be competitive. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so we also saw other cereal companies start to imitate Cheerios and include more fiber, pushing the price back down. And so all of these were changes in price, which economists are really interested in. That's what we're really after, is the changes in price and the resulting behaviors that led to those changes in prices. Now, it's useful to remember, or to keep in mind, that in any market setting, buyers are competing. Okay, so there is competition, but they're not competing against sellers. They're actually competing against other buyers. Okay, there exist scarce goods, and the way that we as buyers can convince sellers to sell to us instead of some other buyer is by offering higher prices than other people are willing to pay. In this case, you can just think about eBay. Right? If you've ever seen or heard of an eBay auction, that's basically how the rest of markets work. The only difference is that rather than a seller at like the grocery store, for example, putting everything up for auction every day, they take their best guess at what the winning auction price is going to be and adjust accordingly over the course of their tenure or their existence. Okay? By contrast, sellers are also competing. But again, they're not competing against buyers, they're competing against other sellers. There are only so many customers in the world after all, and if you want to sell your product to them, well then you have to convince them to buy from you instead of buying from someone else. And the way to do that is by lowering prices. So by lowering prices, right? In the buyer's competing situation, this is by raising prices. And so changing prices are a means of reconciling personal conflicts for the goods that are actually available. The changing prices act to direct production from less highly to more highly demanded goods. They also affect your earnings and the type of work that you are actually going to be willing to do. Now, changing prices over time is typically referred to as inflation. So inflation is equal to a rise in general prices. Okay. Now, if we control for inflation, so if we adjust, our current prices for inflation, the price of basically every good in the world has come down dramatically. Okay, so prices for essentially everything have come down. Unfortunately, there are 3 exceptions that I can think of. Okay, and those exceptions are college textbooks, college tuition, which I'm sure I don't have to remind anyone watching this video of, and finally, healthcare. At least in the US. I don't have the figures for other countries, but I suspect it's probably about the same. Okay, so what does this actually mean? So if we draw our supply and demand, right, we have D1, we have supply 1, we have quantity and price, right? Our equilibrium here, P1 and Q1. Okay, so what we've seen over time is that the demand for various goods and services has increased. Okay, and that makes sense because we see more and more people being born, and the world population continues to rise, and so we should expect the demand for products to be increasing. But we've also seen increases in the supply, and the increase in supply is much larger than the increase in demand, and so as a result, the real inflation-adjusted price of basically everything, again, except for those 3 exceptions, has come down. This is a fantastic thing. Now, we should distinguish between 3 different types of demand. So 3 types of demand. Okay, and we're going to go through one of them today. Okay, so the first one is the demand by one person. The second one could be considered the total demand for or by all people for a particular good. All right, this is often called the market demand curve. Okay, and then the third one is the demand seen by one seller of many of a particular good. So it's the demand seen by one seller of many for a particular good. This is often referred to as the demand facing the seller.